That idea completely changed how people and researchers thought about cancer.
Hi, and welcome to That Cancer Conversation, the podcast that brings together the science and the stories behind cancer. I'm Sophie.
And I'm Nisha from Cancer Research UK.
In this episode, we're looking back, actually all the way back in time to the very start of complex life. Because cancer isn't a modern day disease. It's been around for hundreds of millions of years, which you've mentioned in a previous episode.
Yeah, that was really fun. But cancer itself has always been there. And in fact, we know that dinosaurs had cancer. It's so interesting, right? And we actually had lots of people asking us about that. So we thought, let's go all in. Let's do a whole episode about the history of cancer.
Yeah, I'm so excited because I actually love history, but we don't often get to look back in science.
Yeah, we're all about like the cutting edge, the latest tech. But actually, scientists can learn a lot from looking to the past.
Yeah, I can really understand why people would think cancer is a modern disease, but it's not. It's really old. So when did cancer actually start?
It's a great question. And linked to that question are a few others. How did cancer start? And also why? So picture this. It's hundreds of millions of years ago, and the Earth looks nothing like it does now. The only life forms are single cells. But eventually, those single cells evolved into creatures made up of many cells. So we went from single cells to these multicellular organisms. Now, that sounds a little bit complicated. So do you want to give us a quick biology lesson?
Yeah, well, cells are the basic building blocks of life. We have over 200 different types of cells in our bodies, and they all have different functions. So all these cells are doing all sorts of different jobs to keep us alive. And as an adult human, we're actually made up of 37 trillion cells. So to picture that, Nisha, if you started counting all your cells, that would take you almost 1 million years.
Right. That's a lot of cells. But back then, like every single one of those little cells was its own being, right? But everything that's alive today, including us, evolved from those single-celled blobs. So scientists think that multicellular life emerged when those individual single cells started working together. So they were different creatures, but they started cooperating. They were working together, sharing the resources to help them overall all survive. So over time, those groups of cells became more and more complex with more specialized roles. And then that led to plants, animals, and humans.
Yeah, and then everything we do relies on our cells working together. But where does cancer come into this?
So the theory is that cancer emerged when those early single cells essentially cheated the system. They took advantage of those other cells that were cooperating and working together and they acted in this sort of selfish way. They were just trying to survive themselves in a way that benefited them, but harmed the overall group. And that really lines up with how we see cancer today. Cells growing out of control, doing whatever they can to survive, even if it damages the rest of the body.
So I guess the first time cancer existed was over 100 million years ago, when you have that shift from single cells to multicellular organisms.
So really, cancer isn't modern at all. And it's been with us since the very start of complex life.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling to think about cancer being around for that long.
Yeah.
But let's also talk about cancer and maybe some more recognizable creatures. Like you said, the first, examples of it were in these tiny single-cell blobs that advance into more complex multicellular life. But let's jump around 240 million years ago. Picture this small creature that's a hybrid between a turtle and a lizard. This little animal is called the Popocellus roseni, and I hope I'm saying that right. But archaeologists found a fossil of this guy. And what was really fascinating is they found a tumour. And this tumor, actually, when they look closer, looks really close to a rare human bone cancer that we still see today.
Wow, that's so wild. It's so wild to think about these ancient creatures with a bone cancer that we still see today. And we know that there are other examples of fossils with cancer. There are a few dinosaur fossils with cancer from sort of tens of millions of years ago. But I think the thing that's really interesting is that these fossils are quite rare. It's rare that a creature's remains will actually, fossilize and turn into something that archaeologists can study. So any fossil that we do find is this kind of unique snippet of information. It's a tiny piece of a bigger puzzle that is what life looked like back then. And they can only tell us so much, right? They could only tell us about bone cancers, really. So they couldn't tell us about whether these creatures had blood cancers or whether they had brain tumors. So it's really hard to know how common cancer actually was in these creatures, it's just crazy to think about. And, these dinosaurs, these ancient turtles, they're these kind of recognizable creatures that we've probably heard about in books and movies and stuff, but we wouldn't normally relate to them in any way. But actually, they did face some of the same medical problems that we do today.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't watch Jurassic Park and think one of those dinosaurs had cancer.
Yeah, probably not. But something that we can definitely relate to are the first people. So let's talk about humans and cancer. When did we first experience or understand cancer?
Yeah, let's learn some more history about humans and cancer. I spoke to Dr. Rosalind Campbell. She's a bioarchaeologist and Egyptologist at Purdue University in the US. She also works for the Ancient Cancer Foundation, a paleoncology research organization looking at cancer's long history. Let's hear our chat now. Dr. Rosalind, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Dr. Rosalind, you are a bioarchaeologist and you work for a paleoncology research organization. What does that mean?
Well, a bioarchaeologist is specifically someone who studies human remains from archaeological collections. So I am an archaeologist, I do excavate, but specifically I look at human remains, whether that's skeletons or mummies in some cases. That's my primary focus. And specifically with paleooncology, I'm really interested in looking at the history of cancer in the ancient world. So when I'm studying those human remains, I try to look for evidence of cancer. In some cases, I will also do things like consult ancient medical texts. So I specifically focus mostly on ancient Egypt, although I work around the Middle East as well. So I might try to look at some ancient Egyptian texts and see if there's evidence for cancer there as well. So paleooncology is just the study of cancer oncology in the past, so paleo, and I specifically apply it to human remains rather than, for example, animal remains.
I mean, what made you interested about the history of cancer?
I think cancer is one of those things that has affected so many of us in one form or another. Almost everyone knows someone who's been touched by cancer. So it was certainly on my mind for many years. But I had several friends who got cancer quite young, in their 20s, even and early 30s. And it so happened that when I was in grad school, I had a friend who, when we became friends, she had just beaten cancer. So she'd been diagnosed very young and had gone through treatment, and I'm pleased to say has been cancer free for many years now. But I think it was one of those moments where there was a group of us, four of us, that all felt, cancer is such a common thing and it can be so devastating. And I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not developing new breakthroughs in the study of cancer. So how could I lend my own skills to this field and what could I offer, right? So that was a really we all just sort of talked about it and thought, maybe there's something here. We all study human remains. We all look at evidence for disease in the past. What if we could find evidence of cancer? We've only really started studying cancer intensely in the medical field, really, I'd say in the last 100 to 200 years are where most of our breakthroughs have occurred. So what if we could apply thousands of years of knowledge to that, right? What other ways might we be able to support those doctors who are creating new treatments and that kind of thing? So it was just sort of a natural outgrowth of our desire to use our particular skill set to make something better in the world and apply it in a way that's useful for others.
You're kind of combining like two worlds in a way. I mean, we know that cancer's been around for like millions of years. You know, we've seen that even dinosaurs have had cancer. But when and where did humans first become aware of cancer?
You know, it's a great question. It's also a question that's kind of impossible to answer because cancer, of course, is really multiple forms of neoplastic disease. So neoplastic disease is the proliferation or formation of new bone. It's the short version is it's your body sort of attacking itself and growing unchecked, right? But there's many forms of cancer, as we know now in the modern world. And the difficulty with looking into the past is well, I should say the difficulties, there's many with looking at cancer in the past, is you're looking at a very different set of data. So in the modern world, you know, we look at things like symptoms, we look at tumor growth, we look at white blood cell count. That's not possible in the ancient past in particular. And so it's tricky to say when humans first became aware of neoplastic disease, especially in the ancient world when we don't have x-rays or CT scans. They couldn't see inside the body. So we have references in medical texts to things that might be tumors, that are growths or swellings, things like that, dating back thousands of years. We have references from the ancient Egyptians to things like an ill breast, right? Like a swelling or something like that. But it's really tricky to say that that's definitely cancer because, of course, it could also be any other form of swelling or growth or something like that. So it's tricky to nail that down exactly. We do have reference from Greek medical texts and Greek physicians to, for example, swellings that appear more like what we might think of a cancerous tumor. So, for example, we have some of the Greek physicians, you know, Hippocrates, who talked about swellings that looked like crabs, right? And it would be sort of the spreading image that looked like the legs of a crab. And that's where we actually get the idea of, or the name of cancer, which is carcinos, and that would be the word for cancer, a crab. And that stuck for a really long time. But again, that's only maybe one form or swelling that could have been cancer. So it's hard to say when we actually got our modern understanding of cancer. Probably more, if we really wanted to pinpoint it, we'd have to say when we got internal imaging and could see things like the proliferation of white blood cells, the growth of lesions within the skeleton, not just an external swelling that we can't necessarily trace to any one particular cause.
So we could have had loads of different civilizations identifying something as cancer, but maybe they all described it quite differently.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that is part of the difficulty. We have references from Persian texts to Queen Atossa, who seems to have had some sort of swelling in the breast. We have, of course, I mentioned the swellings in the Egyptian medical texts. We have lots of things that could be cancers. It's just really tricky to say for sure. When we do find evidence for cancer in skeletal remains, it may or may not match up with what we see in the medical text because there's only certain types of cancers that we can find in skeletal remains, and it's often either cancer that is primary to the bone, so it originated in the bone, or it's cancer such as breast cancer or prostate cancer that is spread throughout the entire body. Again, would not necessarily have been visible to doctors or scholars who were looking at people in the past at that time. It's like doing a puzzle with no idea what the final puzzle will look like and a quarter of the pieces. You just have to sort of do your very best, compare as much as you can to modern data and try to make your best educated hypothesis and be honest about what we do and don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that must be quite tough as well, trying to translate all of those sorts of different meanings. I mean, how did ancient doctors try to treat cancer back then?
As best we can tell, most ancient societies would use topical treatments. So this is certainly the case for ancient Egypt. They had a variety of prescriptions that would reduce swelling. And, you know, the Egyptians had a pretty extensive medical literature. Most of the medical texts we have from ancient Egypt are copies of earlier texts. But we're fortunate in that they are often very detailed. They will say, these are the symptoms I observe, you know, these are some ways that you can treat it. And as with most ancient societies, it's some combination of topical treatments and then sometimes a little bit of magic. I would argue that's not so different from modern treatments in many ways. If you don't understand scientific processes, it can feel like magic, even if it works or doesn't. But most of the time it was topical. And unfortunately, of course, with most types of cancers, these might have mitigated some of the pain, but it's very unlikely that most of them would have actually treated the root cause of these cancers.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how doctors might not have known they were dealing with something like cancer, it must have been really hard to think of how to treat cancer at the same time. And are any of these ancient treatments similar to the treatments we use today?
So it's difficult to say, in part because when you're looking at medical texts and prescriptions, especially from ancient Egypt, which of course is a dead language, you don't always know what you're looking at. So sometimes there's this added problem of translation, right? So there's some discussion that there's one type of cucumber that was used in certain poultices in ancient Egypt, and one of the enzymes is sometimes used in modern cancer treatments and types of chemotherapy. But it's really tricky because you're never, well, not never, you're often not entirely certain that you're translating the exact word that you think you are. You might say, well, I think this is a cucumber. And then in 10 years, someone will say, actually, I think it's this other type of vegetable, or it's another subtype of cucumber. And so that can be really tricky to say. We can look at all of these different prescriptions and say that some of them would have been effective, or at least would have likely been effective in treating some of the pain based on some of the ingredients used. And some of the other prescriptions that were used for other conditions would have probably been more effective. I think we have to keep in mind that we're still learning how to treat cancers today, right? And the process of chemotherapy is still often experimental in some ways. We have to adjust dosages. Even surgery, it can be difficult to say whether you've gotten all of a cancerous growth. So we're still learning so much, even now with all of our amazing medical advances. It's tricky to say. We're always learning more, and I think that's the thing to remember.
Definitely. I think, yeah, we're still continually learning, as you said, more about cancer each day. And so back then, having such limited information about it, it must have been quite hard. And then also the translation on top of it. So it must be a big puzzle to kind of put together when you're looking through all these texts. I mean, when it comes to, people who had cancer back in the ancient world, what would have it been like to experience cancer? Would they have gone to their local doctor like we would today?
That's a good question, and I think it depends a lot on what culture they were living in and the attitudes towards medical care. So in a lot of ancient cultures, including Egypt, probably most minor complaints would have just been dealt with at home. Probably a lot of people had some knowledge of poultices and basic treatment. For something like cancer, where you were probably suffering for either a longer period or your symptoms were more acute, they probably would have gone to some kind of healer. In Egypt, it seems that and I'm going to use the term healer because we didn't really have medical school in a traditional sense. There was certainly training for these healers, but it wasn't, like today where you go to many years of school and you practice surgery and you do your residencies. But we did have healers, and in Egypt, they were mostly associated with temples where they seem to have had some kind of training. And so you would probably go to your local healer and say, "This is my complaint, give me some treatment." And again, it would probably be some combination of, here's a poultice, here's something you should drink, and maybe say this prayer and give an offering to this deity, right? It never hurts to cover all your bases. You might as well try the magic as well. And we have some evidence in Egypt for some level of specialization, not for cancer, but for, it seems women mostly dealt with childbirth, but there were certainly medical papyri that talked about reproductive health and caring for pregnant women. So it wasn't strict specialties where certain healers only did one thing, but there were certainly people who knew perhaps a little bit more about treatment of fractures, right? Or reproductive health or something like that. So yeah, it would have also depended on where you lived. If you lived in a small settlement, you would have not had access to probably a very specialized healer. Just like today, right? People who live in very rural areas don't necessarily have access always to cutting edge medical treatments because that is usually found in larger urban areas. So much like today, your socioeconomic status, where you live, would have also affected your access to treatment.
And like, would those cancers be treated at quite a late stage, do you think?
That's a good question, and the answer is probably, in part because so much of what we know about cancer now and how we treat it is based on medical imaging. So we can look inside the body. If someone says, I don't feel well, we can look inside the body and say, your white blood cell count is very high. We are going to treat you as if this was cancer or some other symptom, right? Maybe you have a growth somewhere. In the absence of that, it's likely they would have simply treated the symptoms until cancer got to such a stage that it was very severe. And this is part of the problem with studying cancer in the ancient world, is that it's quite likely many people succumbed to cancer fairly quickly, especially if it was very aggressive, because it couldn't be detected until later. By the time you see a very malignant growth, the cancer may have already spread throughout your body, right? So uh, without CT scans and MRIs and the ability to catch those types of cancer very early, it's quite likely that treatments would have been applied either ineffectively or very late because you didn't know what was going on inside the body.
And you mentioned, some of our current modern day treatments, like chemotherapy, our modern technology like MRIs, and how they've changed how early we can detect cancer. Moving forward through history, I mean, in terms of, ancient history of cancer, what has that taught us? And like, how has it shaped maybe how cancer has been viewed throughout time?
This is probably my favorite question and a huge motivator behind the work that I do. So I think, on the one hand, looking at this history of cancer helps us understand that cancer is not just a modern disease. So for some years, there's been this perception that cancer is a product of modern living, as well as a product of living longer, right? We're living longer than we ever have. And both of these are partially true, but not entirely. And I think of great import for me is this idea that if you accept that cancer is purely or primarily a disease of modern living, I think there's an undercurrent that if you live differently or remove yourself from those things, that you won't get cancer. And I think once you've been diagnosed with cancer, there can be that struggle of trying to understand, what did you deserve this? Did you do something wrong? And I think that can be really, really harmful. And it's also not true. And so I think one of the reasons I wanted to pursue this research is I think by understanding that cancer has always existed, albeit in different forms, we can remove some of that stigma that I think is really harmful, both for patients and for the loved ones of those patients who are struggling to understand why, right? Cancers happen, and I'm not saying there's nothing like we can do to prevent them. There are certainly things we can do, and we're learning more all the time, right? But we're also learning that you could do everything quote unquote right. You could eat all the right foods, you could exercise, do all those things, and you could still get cancer. And that can be discouraging, but I hope that can also be freeing, because all we can do is the best we can, knowing that this is a suite of diseases that has afflicted populations since the dinosaurs, right? Long before we were even on the map. And that there's some freedom in that, in a sense. And we can just do the best we can to learn more about more effective treatments. I think history has a lot to offer science, and science has a lot to offer history, but we also need to remember to talk to each other and study each other's languages, if you will, and learn that art of translation for other fields as best we can.
Dr. Rosalind, thank you so much for being on this episode. We're going to keep exploring the history of cancer for the rest of the episode. And thank you so much for joining.
I love that story about how cancer got its name from the Greek word karkanos, meaning crab, because a tumour looked like a crab spreading through the body.
Yes, and also it makes sense now why the astrological sign is called Cancer, because when you look up in the sky, the constellation looks like a crab. I also love the bit about matching like human remains with text imaging they were trying to study, and not only that, trying to translate those ancient texts into what we would have today. So they would probably have had to translate one word maybe 5 times to get to what we call it today.
Yeah, because it's I think she said it's actually a dead language. So you're trying to translate something from a language that no one really knows anymore into like medical language. Yeah, we know that we do have the oldest medical record that we have is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and it actually describes what we now think was breast cancer. And in the treatment notes, it basically just says there is none. So that kind of gives us a sense of how humans first experienced and try to understand cancer, and now how researchers like Dr. Rosalind are trying to piece that history together. But let's move forward and let's think about how our understanding of cancer has changed since then.
Yeah, because as Dr. Rosalind said, in ancient Egypt, people didn't really know what cancer was. And that stayed true for a really long time, actually. And it wasn't until the 1700s that doctors started to properly investigate the disease. They began doing autopsies and linking symptoms that people had in life to what they actually died from, which is obviously something we still do. We still do autopsies today to find out why people have died and their cause of death.
Yeah, so looking for that cause of death, this cause of illness, was becoming, more and more important. And one of the first big discoveries that related to cancer was in 1775, when a doctor called Percival Pott,
Great name,
linked chimney soot to scrotal cancer in London chimney sweeps. So this was one of the first examples of an environmental or an exposure causing cancer. And it's really sad because a lot of these chimney sweeps were children, people that were small enough to get into the chimney. But, that wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was actually probably one of the first examples of an occupational health hazard. And of course, throughout the years, we've learned more and more about these kinds of hazards, these exposures that are linked to an increased risk of cancer. I'm thinking like tobacco, UV radiation from the sun and all sorts of things. But that's skipping ahead. So alongside these early epidemiological studies in the 1700s, where doctors were trying to understand why particular groups were experiencing cancer or experiencing different illnesses, you can see that there are these two paths. There is the one path of scientists trying to understand cancer, and then the other side of the doctors trying to treat it better. So scientists were building their understanding of human biology. They were working out exactly what cells were and what was inside them. But on the treatment side of things, they were also making strides. So one of the earliest treatments of cancer was surgery. So that had been around for centuries, but it was pretty brutal. Surgeons were seen as kind of butchers. It was like a last resort type of treatment. Before anesthesia, speed was the most important thing. You can imagine you don't want a surgery without any pain relief going on for any longer than it needed to. So there are these stories of surgeons who could amputate a leg in less than a minute.
Wow.
Yeah. But once things like anesthesia, antiseptic, antibiotics came along, surgery became far safer, far more effective, and just more widely accepted.
Yeah, I mean, anesthesia must have been super important and kind of one of the first, areas of looking at patient care, especially with surgery. I don't think I would want to go through a surgery without anesthesia.
No way.
But surgery was actually probably then one of the first ways of removing cancer from the body. But then we move into the 20th century and everything speeds up. So one of the organisations that eventually becomes Cancer Research UK, they started some of their earliest work in radiotherapy, but also around the same time, or maybe even before that, we have scientists like Marie and Pierre Curie who were working on radiation, and it was becoming a really interesting area for both imaging and treatment. So in those early days, scientists didn't really realize how dangerous radiation could be. So it would often cause hands being burnt and maybe even death sometimes.
Yeah, it's so sad because actually that is what led to Marie Curie's death in the end. But, you know, she left this amazing legacy. You know, her early work did lead to the development of radiotherapy, which is a treatment that saves millions of lives around the world every year. So that was in the 20s and the 30s, where Cancer Research UK scientists were really developing radiotherapy. They were working out how cells responded to radiation and thinking about doses, and then that is what eventually led to radiotherapy. But let's move forward now into the 40s, and there was another massive treatment breakthrough. And if you think about the 40s, that might sound like a sort of a strange time to be having these scientific breakthroughs, you know, given the world events that were going on. And actually, the Second World War did slow down a lot of research efforts. But the surprising thing is it also kind of spurred ahead some interesting developments. So after the horrors of mustard gas in World War I, scientists were trying to understand the chemical that was mustard gas better. They were trying to work out its structure, understand what it did, and find antidotes. But interestingly, doctors noticed that soldiers that had been exposed to mustard gas had a very low white blood cell count. Their white blood cells had died. And this sparked the idea that maybe this chemical could kill other types of cells as well. And that really was the birth of chemotherapy.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, from war to life-saving treatment, you know? But that was happening in the US, where scientists were trying to understand mustard gas better. But then in the UK, Professor Alexander Haddow, one of Cancer Research UK's brilliant chemists, was also studying mustard gas. And in 1948, he published groundbreaking research which showed exactly how mustard gas could kill cancer cells. But then, even more importantly, he showed that we could make the chemical less toxic but better at killing cancer cells, so more effective.
I mean, it's so interesting that almost finding the precise dose of a poison could turn it into a medicine.
Yeah.
But I mean, of course, there are side effects like any medicine, but chemotherapy has transformed survival for so many cancers, and it continues to be developed and improved so that more people can survive. For example, today, around 9 in 10 men with testicular cancer survive long term. And that's largely thanks to treatments that grew out of this early work that you've just mentioned.
Yeah, I do think it's important to remember that. Chemotherapy really changed the game. It was totally transformative. But around this same time, thanks to some of this work actually, scientists were starting to realize something huge. They worked out that cancer was happening because the DNA inside of our cells was damaged. That idea completely changed how people and researchers thought about cancer. So those two paths, you know, understanding cancer and treating it were, you know, starting to converge.
Yeah, I mean, that takes us into a really super important point about how visualizing cancer internally is such a big breakthrough for us. Because as Dr. Rosalind mentioned, ancient Egyptians didn't have that access to see inside the body. They were really relying on outside cues of whether something wrong was happening. And that meant that probably these cancers that these ancient Egyptians were going through might have been caught at a much later stage. And we know that that usually makes it harder to treat. But that changed in the 1970s when we have CT and MRI scanners being developed. So the first clinical CT scanner was installed in Wimbledon, actually. And the first patient scanned had a suspected brain tumor. But this was printed on a Polaroid, which is kind of crazy to think about getting a Polaroid picture
Yeah.
of a scan.
Yeah.
But imagine just being that first patient lying in this very almost sci-fi looking machine. It must have been a bit scary, actually, thinking about it.
It's quite scary to go into a CT scan now when you have to go into the
Yeah.
machine. So imagine what it would have been like back then when people didn't even really like it was so uncommon. Well, didn't even exist. So
Well, now we know that Wimbledon isn't the only place for just tennis. It's now the place of CT scanners.
yeah, and so while that was all happening, while doctors and researchers were trying to visualize cancer better through these scanners, they were also trying to understand it on a deeper level. So they'd worked out that cancer was a disease of our cells and of DNA, but they didn't know exactly what was going wrong. There was a lot of interest in whether infections might play a role. So we'd seen that viruses could cause cancer in animals. So scientists were trying to work out if viruses could have a role in cancer in people too.
And that led us to a really big moment when, in the 80s, scientists proved the link between human papillomavirus, or better known as HPV, and cervical cancer. And that then led to Cancer Research UK scientists showing that nearly all cervical cancers are caused by HPV, which then helped develop an HPV vaccine. And that is now known to prevent around 90% of cervical cancers. So it's been a huge shift just by knowing that little piece of information about viruses.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about that. That was completely transformative, the HPV vaccine. That was, the first time, or one of the first times probably, that we could genuinely stop a cancer before it even started, right? And that brings us to something else really interesting that was happening in the 80s. So for so long, we'd assumed that cancer must have been caused by something external, an infection, an injury, a virus, but something from the outside world. But researchers were starting to realize and understand that sometimes our own cells could go wrong all by themselves because of tiny faults in our DNA. And this is where one of my favorite stories of cancer research comes in. And that's the discovery of EGFR. So back in the early 80s, a young scientist called Julian Downward was studying growth factors. So these are little biological signals that tell cells when to grow and when to divide. So one of them, called EGF, we knew that made cells grow when it attached to a little receptor on the surface of cells. So that receptor is called EGFR. We didn't really know how that worked exactly. So Downward set out to work this out. And, back then, research and technology wasn't like it is today. It was much slower. So he spent months in the lab trying to isolate that little receptor and then trying to understand its genetic makeup, its DNA. So he was typing data into a computer that updated by post every couple of months. So it was slow work. But all this work did lead to something good. Eventually, he spotted something strange. Part of the genetic makeup of that EGFR, that receptor, looked almost identical to a protein from a virus that we already knew caused cancer in chickens.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was really, the light bulb moment.
So a virus was doing this in chickens, but in humans it was doing it all by itself?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. So suddenly cancer wasn't just a disease of fast-growing cells. It wasn't a disease caused by something external. It was a disease of misfiring instructions in its own instruction manual. And that idea changed everything. So instead of just using treatments like radiotherapy and chemotherapy that aimed to destroy any fast-growing cell, scientists realized that they could design drugs that would specifically switch off the faulty signals coming from internal things like EGFR.
And so that's really probably one of the first real steps towards personalized medicine, and choosing a treatment based off an exact genetic fault in a person's tumor. And that must have been quite huge, actually, trying to understand faulty genes, this real hallmark cause of cancer on such a microscopic level. Because I don't think we actually really knew like how many genes a human actually had at that point.
No, that's the interesting thing. So at that time, we didn't really understand the human genome. So if you think about it like this, the human genome is like our instruction manual for life. It's made up of all our genes, which are sections of DNA. So those sections of DNA, those genes are like the paragraphs in the overall instruction manual. But the thing was, at that time, like we couldn't actually read the whole book. We didn't know what was in it. But that was only until the 90s. So in the 90s, the Human Genome Project began. So this was this enormous international effort to map every single gene, read every paragraph in human DNA. And it took nearly 13 years and it cost around £2 billion, which is pretty wild because, you know, you can go and get your DNA sequenced in like a day now.
Yeah.
But once that map existed, once we could read the manual, everything changed. Suddenly, scientists could pinpoint the exact genetic changes that were faulty in cancer or other diseases. For example, Cancer Research UK scientists help identify the BRCA genes. So these are genes which, when faulty, increase someone's risk of multiple cancers. And later we were able to develop drugs that specifically targeted those faults. So at this point, we had the whole human genome. Suddenly, scientists had access to so much genetic information. And that really set the stage for the modern era of cancer research, where we're not just treating cancer, we're understanding it at the deepest possible level.
Yeah, and that pretty much brings us to the modern day where we're still trying to understand cancer better, but we're also finding new ways to prevent it, diagnose it earlier, and treat it more precisely. I mean, we've got things like immunotherapy, and that involves empowering the immune system in our own bodies to find and destroy cancer. There are also blood tests being developed which can pick up cancer earlier, and surgeries which are becoming way more precise thanks to things like AI that scientists are looking into. And that's really all the things we discuss on this podcast and that cancer conversation.
Yeah, I mean, those really are the topics of now. That's what's happening now, because right now we're in this golden age of cancer research where we're able to understand cancer better than we ever could before. But not only that, we also have this incredible historical context, thanks to people like Dr. Rosalind. And it's just so crazy to think about the fact that cancer has been part of the story of life since the very start of life.
Yeah, so it's not really modern at all when we think about it. It's been around since, like you said, complex life started, which was a long time ago.
Exactly. Cancer really has this multi-million year head start on us. But, you know, when you reflect on all these amazing medical and biological advances that we kind of take for granted now, you can see, like, from all these incredible breakthroughs that we are actually catching up. You know, we're getting closer and closer.
I think that's a perfect place to end this episode and this conversation.
Yeah, it was a really good chat.
Thanks for watching this episode of That Cancer Conversation. If you're enjoying the show, you can give us a like and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. All of this episode's resources are in the description box below. And for more cancer stories, you can visit our website, Cancer News. Also, if you have a question you'd like to ask us, you can comment below or email podcast@cancer.org.uk.